All right, and it looks like we are live. Welcome all to this special installment of the NAF Research and Tech Talk series. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Minar. I'm the Director of Research and Reporting at NAF. We have a very special Research and Tech Talk for you today, and we're going to be joined by a special guest, Julia Freeland Fisher. But before we bring out Julia, I just wanted to spend a moment to say thank you and to welcome everyone for joining us live here today. If you've never attended one of these research and tech talks before, that's quite all right. Really, the purpose of these talks, which are hosted monthly, we tend to host them every month, is really to bring cutting edge research and best practices to you, our NAF educators, so that you can use that information to improve your practice or perhaps just get ideas about how to best serve your students. As such, don't be afraid to ask questions or make comments in the chat throughout the talk today. We do really love audience participation, so if you have a burning question that's bubbling up during the course of the talk, be sure to drop that in the chat, and we're going to do our best to address it and get you the expert opinion of our esteemed guest, Julia, today. But just so you know, we're also going to have some dedicated time at the end of the session for question and answer, so you can choose how you want to ask your question. That being said, if you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, please go ahead and do that. Just tell us, who you are, where you're coming from today, what school or organization you're with. We like to make these research and tech talks a small learning community, so by no means don't be shy. Just another quick word before we get started. All of these NAF research and tech talks are recorded and posted to social media after they take place. So aside from archiving the broadcast on the NAF Next portal, which will be available after this event, you can also find it on our NAF YouTube channel, our NAF Educator Facebook page, as well as the NAF Research and Tech LinkedIn page. So if you haven't done so already, please visit the NAF Educator Facebook page, as well as the NAF Research and Tech LinkedIn page, and give us a follow on both of those if you'd like. I'm dropping those links in the chat below if you'd like to check those out and give us a follow. So our guest today is a woman I've had a pleasure of getting to know over the past year and a half or so, and it's my pleasure to introduce Julia Freeland Fisher. Julia is the Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute, where she leads a team that educates policymakers and community leaders on the power of disruptive innovation in the K-12 and higher education space. Julia has published and spoken extensively on topics such as the EdTech market, blended learning, competency-based education, and the future of schools. She is the author of Who You Know, Unlocking Innovations That Expand Students' Networks, which was published in 2018. Julia holds a bachelor's degree from Princeton and a JD degree from Yale Law School. So I'm really happy to have the chance to sit down with Julia today and to have this chat. Julia is already on screen, so Julia, really good to see you today, and thank you for taking the time to join us here at NAF Next.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I've been a big fan from afar of the NAF model, and I'm excited to get to know you guys better during the session. So happy to be here.
Great. Well, we're hoping the educators participating today and the other folks in the audience will have some questions for you, but we're just going to dive right into it and kind of set the stage and share some materials. I thought I'd start our conversation today just by having us introduce the topic of social capital more generally, as well as to get a little information on your interest in it for the folks in the audience who may not be as familiar with that topic. So the term social capital has a lot of definitions floating around out there, but can you kind of bring us all in and set the stage a little bit and give us your definition of social capital?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is, so I am not sort of a PhD researcher by training, but when I embarked on this research on new models for expanding students' networks, I quickly encountered like 25 different definitions of social capital. So I'm not going to endeavor to give you guys all of the nitty gritty. At the most basic level, though, what those definitions all have in common is that social capital is the concept that our networks contain real value. So you'll hear researchers like economists talk about financial capital and human capital. What we have, right, our financial capital that we can go out and buy stuff with. Our human capital, what we know and can do, and we will then get paid in the labor market to know and to do. Social capital is a little slippery, though, as a concept, right? Because the idea that our networks contain resources, those resources aren't always as obvious as dollars and cents or skills. Sometimes they are, right? Sometimes it's literally that you know someone who's willing to lend you money or lend you their car or lend you some sort of actual sort of financial or financially adjacent resource. Sometimes it's someone who has a skill set and is willing to help you. Sometimes it comes, though, in the form of emotional support, in the form of a reference for a job, a referral to a job, right? And all of these ways in which that value manifests are actually in some ways a lot harder to measure than financial and human capital. And so I think in part because of that, social capital gets a lot of sort of attention in the research, and practically speaking is a lot harder to sort of implement as a strategy or an asset in schools and institutions. But that's really the basic idea. Our networks contain value. We can all think back to someone who helped us get by or get ahead in life. And that was an instance of us experiencing the upside of social capital and in some ways the sort of intangible benefits that our relationships often lend us just in our day-to-day lives.
Definitely. Yeah, the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, has been around as long as I can remember, but social capital really kind of wraps that all up nicely and is essentially trying to break that down and study it in measurement. So I'm really interested to get into it with you here today. Just to set the stage a little more though, what was your motivating factor for studying social capital? Was it a personal interest or was there some kind of event that led you to it? Give us a bit of context there.
Yeah, a couple different life factors. So maybe just building on that kind of popular phrase you just named, Nick, the idea that it's not what you know, it's who you know. I think what the research actually shows, the empirical research, particularly on economic mobility and access to opportunity, is that opportunity actually sits at the cross-section of what you know and who you know. So it's not instead of what you know, but it's this complementary asset. Given that an estimated half of jobs come through personal connections, right? And we rarely talk about that fact in education, but it's actually really important if we're talking about helping young people break into careers. It's also who knows what you know, which we can get into down the line, which is sort of more of an assessment point. But my own personal journey to this was really coming from work in education that was focused on the what you know. I started my career at a place called New Schools Venture Fund, which was a firm investing in new models in education, and all of the metrics of success that they were measuring those investments against were test scores. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sort of an anti-testing advocate here to convince you that tests are bad necessarily, but I was also a young person experiencing the world of work sort of early in my career and seeing all of the ways in which networks really mattered immensely. And yet we weren't talking about that as we were talking about what a successful education pathway looked like. We were so focused on just skills and competencies and persistence. And again, acknowledging that all those things are important, but it feels like we're selling a little bit of a lie or a myth of meritocracy to young people if we're just saying it's what you know, not who you know as well, that matters. The second thing that drove me to study this is that the Christensen Institute, where I work, we're a small nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we're best known historically for our research in online and blended learning before the dismal year that we just experienced in online and blended learning. But I was looking a lot at kind of the rise of ed tech. And I was so struck because this was starting back around 2013, 2014. In 2013, 2014, we were awash in social media. We were using video conferencing technologies. We had all of these technologies at our fingertips that could allow us to connect at the press of a button. And yet, if you looked at the mainstream ed tech market, it was dominated by content assessment and productivity tools. Rarely were we using technology to connect students, particularly to people they might otherwise not know. And so I saw this also as really an opportunity in the ed tech space to not just use technology for productivity, but to actually unleash ed tech that connects, and started tracking down more tools that are doing that. And happy to talk about where we see sort of opportunities there. It continues to be kind of a really small pocket of the market, but that may be getting some tailwinds from the past year of the pandemic.
Definitely. Yeah. From my own personal experience, during my short time at NAF, it's been almost 3 years now, I've definitely seen a rise in the importance of those types of connecting tools, so not just used for assessment and things like that. So with social capital and kind of measuring it in young people, trying to improve it in young people, what are some of those and it's still gaining popularity, but what are those pressing issues in this space? Why is it important for educators to know what social capital is? Why should they be concerned about its growth in their students?
Yeah, so I could sort of wax philosophical on all the ways that relationships matter. We know from decades of youth development research that relationships are integral to healthy development. We also know, as I just alluded to, that relationships are a key conduit to jobs, right? So if we're not paying attention, particularly to the equitable distribution of networks, we're actually not sort of addressing the whole of opportunity and opportunity gaps. There's also, I think, a blind spot that we maybe became aware of as an education system in the past year, which is that schools routinely don't have a great grasp of who their students already know, who are members of what researchers would call their unbounded network. So not just their strongest connections in the classroom or the school building, but truly who are the sort of like naturally occurring mentors, connections, near peers in their lived experiences beyond the four walls of school, who are likely having an immense impact on their educational journey, but may not sort of be part of how we've organized school.
Right.
The last thing I'll name, again, this question could just be me riffing
Sure.
for like 3 hours, so I'm going to spare you all of my pontificating. But the last thing that I think is a really pressing and emergent issue is the distinction between what sociologists call strong ties and weak ties in young people's lives. So strong ties and weak ties, sort of what they sound like, but just a quick definition. Our strong ties are the people that we spend the most time with, have in theory the highest levels of trust with. They're also the people that are most likely to look out for us and lend us actual resources and sort of emotional support. But strong ties are interesting because our brains can only handle so many of them, right? So my husband, lovely, caring man who takes really good care of me, lends me all sorts of resources, emotional support, also takes up a ton of my bandwidth, right? You may see him walking around in the background and I'll have to like manage him, right? It takes up bandwidth to have a strong tie. And so we can only have so many of them. But we also have many more of what sociologists often refer to as weak ties. These are sort of acquaintances, looser networks. Nick, I would call you a weak tie in my life, which is not a value judgment, but we talk every so often. Sure. And yet I'm only sitting here in this session because of a weak tie, not because of a strong tie. And that actually reflects what researchers have been documenting since the 1970s, which is the phenomenon of the strength of weak ties. We're actually more likely to find jobs through our weak tie networks because they're more likely to contain new information and new opportunities, and they tend to be less redundant than our strong tie networks, right? Many people in our strong tie networks know one another, whereas Nick, you don't know a lot of my weak ties, right? And vice versa. And that distinction, I think, has been underexplored in education, where for very rational reasons, there tends to be a bias of the stronger the tie, the better, because of all that youth development research that prioritizes strong relationships for healthy development. Again, that remains true. And yet I think we may be sleeping on the power of diversifying students' weak tie networks in ways that really could expand their sense of future possible selves and opportunities down the line. So that's really an emergent area that we've been paying a lot of attention to, in particular where tech has a role to play there, where technology can play that role of expanding weak ties, but even just philosophically, not assuming that a brief interaction has to be a hollow one.
Right. No, those are great kind of setting the stage definitions and just kind of prepping for our discussion here. I wanted to hit one more question before we actually launch into the playbook that we'll be talking about for the rest of the session. And that's really why social capital research is important when you hear about students who are from ethnic minorities or traditionally underserved and marginalized communities. And this will kind of be a theme that we talk about as we go through the playbook. But can you say a few words on that? Like, why is social capital really gaining momentum as a mechanism for overcoming some of those inequities that we see in our education and our job market system?
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a mechanism. In some ways, social capital the phenomenon of social capital and networks mattering can accelerate and perpetuate inequity. But I think paying attention to it and more deliberately fostering and measuring it through the lens of equity can actually can make headway on addressing opportunity gaps. So a couple issue areas here, and we'll probably revisit these as we talk through the playbook, Nick. But the first is, there's obviously a lot of, I think, rhetoric in the education space right now around acknowledging the assets in students' lives, particularly assets in students' lives for students and families that have been, as you said, sort of marginalized historically. Just to harken back to this idea that schools rarely know who students know, part of that kind of deficit lens is not acknowledging the existing social networks that students from marginalized communities actually already possess, but may not have been acknowledged by our formal systems, right? And so that's like kind of step one, and we'll talk about some strategies to do that. But I think recognizing the existing, not just strengths that a student, him or herself possesses, but strengths within his or her broader network is really critical. The second, though, is to paying attention and being realistic about where different inherited networks do contain different resources, right? So one way to explain sort of income gaps that are intergenerational is the fact that intergenerational wealth transfer is perpetuating and in many ways worsening inequality. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we all inherit a network has huge bearing, not just on the financial resources at our disposal, but also on what researchers call our occupational identity. You guys may have heard the phrase, if you can't see it, you can't be it if you can't see it. And what really bears out in the research is that who students know shape their perception of who they can become. And so if a student, let's say, has aspirations to work in a field where he or she actually doesn't know anyone working in that field, that actually has a real limiting effect on their prospects. Now, if you look at data on who parents know, right, as one indicator, we know that parents with a bachelor's degree or more are twice as likely to know professors, CEOs, lawyers, and congresspeople. Whether you want to know a congressperson in 2021, totally different conversation, right? But if we just want to pay attention to sort of the occupational prospects and particularly access to the knowledge economy that different students experience vis-a-vis their networks, that is not necessarily equally distributed, right. And so needs to be addressed. The last thing I'd say is I think there's a fairly evolved conversation in the sort of college and post-secondary space around first generation college students needing additional instrumental and financial supports to navigate college. So one of the big misconceptions that I think is starting to get corrected in that literature is that first gen college students need emotional support outside of their families. Actually, their families continue to be the primary source of first gen students' emotional support. However, if no one in your family attended college and you really are sort of breaking new ground, you may need additional support to know how to navigate a campus, how to negotiate financial aid, et cetera. And a lot of, I think, student support organizations are stepping into that space. Mm-hmm. I don't think that conversation is as mature in the career space, where if you are the first generation in your family to work in a particular career, what are the sorts of relationships and resources you may need to but it hasn't necessarily how I think education systems, much less employers, think about supporting first-gen employees who may not have had exposure or deep networks into a given industry. So that's a lot of the ways we think about this. First, acknowledging existing assets that often go untapped and under-recognized in students' existing networks, but also being very realistic that opportunity gaps often reflect relationship gaps, and those are going to be perpetuated if we, again, only focus on skills and competencies and ignore this sort of social side of opportunity.
Wow. Yeah, totally agree. And NAF is really kind of being much more sensitive these days to those kinds of things. How can we connect students to a professional in the career cluster they may be interested in so that they have someone they could reach out to for that additional support that you just mentioned?
And I think just real quick, an asset-based way to do that is like first not assume that the student doesn't know anyone. That's like the slippage that I think even well-intended interventions can fall into. Don't assume they don't know anyone. This is easier said than done, but we can talk about some of the schools that we see doing that now. Well,
definitely. So now that we kind of have set the stage a bit, I actually do want to launch into that tool that you and your co-author Minar released earlier this year. Let me get that up on screen really quick. Bear with me here while I get that on screen. I'm going to drop a link to this in the chat as well. So
I can do that right now.
Oh,
I have it committed to memory.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So yeah, but this is really the resource that that we wanted to be talking about today, and this is really the reason that kind of brought us together here today. But just a quick introduction. This resource is titled 5 Steps for Building and Strengthening Students' Networks, which is obviously also the name of our session here today. And if you're interested in downloading the PDF, that is actually the playbook that is attached to this session details. So you can view that either after the session or during, however you'd like. But this resource is really meant to be an educator-friendly playbook, which is meant for all types of audiences: teachers, nonprofits, anyone interested in strengthening those students' networks and making those new connections. So I'm gonna skip down a little bit and just kind of talk about the structure of the playbook before we actually get into it here. So each step for building and strengthening students' networks is broken down within this playbook and has a number of useful elements within each section. So for example, I'm just going to scroll down here. You can see the 5 steps we're going to talk about in this session here today. But I also wanted to point out that each section has a number of subsections, and you can actually see those when you get into the playbook.
Click into step 1.
Yeah, is it in there? Okay, yeah. I had it open, but I wasn't as familiar. So yeah, each of these subsections are meant to be, again, user-friendly, but they offer things like guiding questions to consider around each of these steps for strengthening networks, meaningful metrics to consider. The one that I particularly like is kind of the current research on this and the current state of the field, and also a couple extra strategies from the field for measuring and kind of capturing some of these networks. Number 4, the subsection is those program spotlights, where you and your co-author actually spotlight an organization or an institution, kind of doing a deep dive into how they're measuring and implementing some of these steps you mentioned. And then there's also a section called Putting It into Practice, where the reader can download kind of helpful worksheets to accompany, that are pertinent to that particular step. And then lastly, there's literally a long list at the end of each section about tools and resources, where the reader can be directed if they want to explore more or, outside of what is in this playbook. Did I miss anything in there, or is that pretty much sum up the different
No, that's
subsections?
the overwhelming list of everything in this, this asset.
Okay, great. Well, let's just dive into it here with step 1. Within the playbook that you and Minar put together, this first step is really taking stock, and the playbook describes this as a step of, like you already actually kind of alluded to, looking at students' existing networks and identifying potential resources in those networks and identifying gaps. Why is this often overlooked, and what should educators consider when they're trying to look at this or measure this?
Yeah, so let me take one step back, Nick, and just explain kind of the overall purpose of the playbook, just to orient folks, because I think this actually will start to answer your question of why, frankly, all of these steps are getting overlooked in our traditional education systems. We came at this through the lens of, obviously, you would be hard-pressed, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, to find anyone working in education today who would disagree with the statement that relationships matter, right? It's basically almost a cliche. What we wanted to say is, yes, relationships matter, but what does it mean to actually put that into strategic action and think about relationships as outcomes in their own right, that you are paying attention to in a data-driven way, and that you think of as a programmatic outcome. And so to create this entire playbook, we built this on the basis of a loose kind of learning network that we've been running for the past 3 years of 18 national organizations that do just that treat social capital as a programmatic outcome in its own right, alongside skills and other competencies, collect data on students' relationships and networks and the health of those networks, and are actually constantly trying to improve their strategies for building students' networks. So that to me is like a very different starting point than the kind of we care about relationships as a culture in our school, or as a kind of climate intervention. But no, we actually think of relationships as valuable assets that we want students to walk away with alongside their degrees and diplomas. Mm-hmm. So that's the animating sort of impetus behind this entire playbook. Step 1, as you asked, Nick, sort of why does this go unaddressed? And I think part of it is that it can be really overwhelming. Measuring, again, what's called unbounded networks it's quite easy in the era of big data, but it's quite hard if you're already a capacity constrained organization who's just scraping by having sort of caregiver and emergency contact information and maybe doing some assessments around educator-student relationships, right, which have become more popular in recent years with the rise of SEL interventions. But we really see this particularly for schools sort of operating a model like NAF, where you're trying to foster career connected or out of school work experiences, et cetera, as a chance to actually identify the existing assets that are latent in your community that actually could be tapped to accomplish your strategic goals. This is also a really important step, again, for students to recognize that they may be in possession of connections and networks that they don't see as such, right? When you're an adolescent, you're not thinking about networking maybe in the way that like when you're 30 or 40, you're thinking about your next career move. It may come more intuitively. But if you have a neighbor or a friend of a neighbor or a member of your faith community, you may just see them as that. You may not see them as a professional contact. And so creating opportunities for students to reflect on who they know, who can help them accomplish their goals, and sort of scaffolding that conversation is such a powerful way to again, tap into existing resources in young people's lives. We highlight a couple strategies here. I just want to call out one that feels sort of a close cousin to what I know a lot of NAF programs might appreciate. The Big Picture Learning Network, which is a network of internship-based learning high schools across the frankly, across the world, is one of our program spotlights. And what they've done at the beginning of every year as they're trying to source internships, rather than having the internship coordinator shoulder, frankly, the immense burden of forging enough partnerships to scale internship access, they have students actually upload who they know in their networks to their internship management system in Blaze, who could not only offer them internships, but could offer internship opportunities to their peers. So suddenly you actually have students exchanging their social capital with one another vis-a-vis this kind of exercise and tool. And so I think that's important to sort of call out as like mapping relationships for mapping's sake is not a good use of anyone's time and could actually sort of backfire and send the message of, well, why did we do that? Why do networks actually matter? But integrating mapping networks into sort of a strategic priority like scaling internships is a really powerful way to take advantage of, again, hidden assets that I think schools were just not designed to tap into in their traditional design.
Right. I would love to try to attach the statistics. So not only 50% of the jobs, come from weak ties, but 50% of the internships as well. I would love to have some data on that students are tapping into their weak ties.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wish I had the number. I could pull this up if you start talking about something else. Could I have a second? But Matthew Hoare, a researcher out of University of Wisconsin, just published a new study on internships in the era of COVID, in particular looking at some of the underwhelming results of online internships, which we could talk about as well. But they got some really interesting data on, it was over half of students had secured their internships. These were college students, not high school students, had secured their internships through friends and family and professors. So the data appears to be tracking kind of across that population as well.
That's great. I hope my NAF.
I mean, it's not great. I have mixed feelings about that data point, right? But it's telling that these informal sources continue to pay dividends.
I hope my NAF colleagues are taking notes about how we could potentially utilize those untapped networks. In order to keep us on track, though, I want to get to step 2 of the playbook.
Yeah, sorry.
No, this is wonderful info. So please continue. But how about I switch over here? Let's talk about step 2, kind of shoring up network support to ensure that every student has access to a web of supportive relationships. Now, what is that, and really how can educators tackle that step?
Yeah, so this notion of a web of supports or a web of relationships really came out of research from the Ceres Institute and America's Promise Alliance, led by 2 researchers named John Zapp and Shannon Varga. And what I think is important to acknowledge here is that in the youth development field, you sometimes hear calls for more access to mentors, or what gets called sort of like the one caring adult that every young person needs. And yet what Zapp and Varga have found over and over again is that in fact, a web of support is far more powerful as a buffer against risk, particularly risk of dropping out, but more generally sort of the need to be supported. A web of support is much more powerful than a single mentor, which is sort of an obvious statement. But one more interesting thing to point out there is that part of the reason a web of support is so powerful is that young people have different needs at different times. And naturally, in the same way that you and I, Nick, probably do, therefore turn to different people depending on those needs. So it's inorganic to sort of assume that a single mentor or caring adult is going to be the sort of catch-all solution to everything. That said, the other important thing that the research shows is that the sort of most powerful and resilient webs of support do have an anchor relationship, so a particularly strong tie that can sort of activate that web as needed. So I think this is important. I mean, this is mostly important in the wake of COVID as we need to do a fundamental rethinking of student support. That would be a different session and panel discussion entirely. But thinking about, even when you're bringing young people into a workplace, what does their web of support look like? It's not just a single supervisor or mentor, but is there a coordinated effort to have access to a near peer, a peer, a supervisor, and a NAF staff member? I don't know sort of the choreography of your particular model, but not, again, sort of defaulting to one source of support,
right?
One relationship, one source of support.
Yeah, it's important to have that anchor, but we actually had a question here in the chat. So does a web reference in some way an access to technology? No, that's actually not what Julia was talking about.
Thank you, Mark
but more
Lesser.
like, yeah, but more like, yeah.
This is a web of humans. Yeah. Yep. And again, sort of thinking about having different people to turn to for different needs, but again, what these researchers found is that the most resilient webs are themselves connected. So the supervisor actually knows the near peer mentor who knows the educator, and there could be coherent communication across those people, which again, this is sort of common sense, but we now have empirical data to show that that network structure is actually the best sort of structure of support that we can surround young people with. And I just want to connect this back to step one, right? This can feel very overwhelming when I'm talking to school administrators about webs of support, and they're like, well, we just got over the hurdle of ensuring that every student has a mentor, right? Like, and that in of itself was really overwhelming. If you view webs of support as something that you have to single-handedly as an institution provide, it will collapse under the weight of student to staff ratios. If you view webs of support instead as how are we coordinating connection across students' existing networks and these new networks we're putting in place, suddenly this becomes a lot more feasible, and it's a little bit more of like a coordination challenge, not a straight up resource challenge.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a really helpful distinction, because it's not necessarily our place to establish that web, right? But rather have the students utilize their existing web more efficiently. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, and create some connectivity if there's sort of disconnect across that web. The last piece I point out, and this didn't get as much attention as I wanted it to in this playbook because we were trying to cover so much ground, but the fact that peers and near peers can be really powerful members of these webs of support, I think we often forget because we sort of discount the expertise already contained in those peer and near peer networks. In fact, young people are more likely to see a near peer as a credible source of support and guidance than perhaps a formal staff member, right? They're closer in age and experience, and they may therefore be more trusted. So really think broadly about who could be a member of that web, and think in an asset-based way about who already is there that students are leaning on, even if that may not be a formal member of your staff or team.
Excellent. Yeah. Let's pivot to step 3, expanding networks to expand networks, helping students forge new connections. Now, this step in the playbook is really described as helping students make those industry-specific connections, right? So they're exposed to people working in their career cluster or their career path that interests them. One interesting thing in what the research says about this section is that students know they should be making those types of connections, but they often struggle, with making those industry connections. So not only educators and those of us at NAF, we know we want to have those students make those industry connections, and we know that's an issue when they don't. But students also know that it's an issue when they don't make those connections. So can you comment on what you've seen kind of successful in that domain, or how can we help students really make those new industry connections?
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's just first to give credit to that research you just named. That came from a study that came out last year from also from America's Promise, called Finding a Way Forward. They did a series of focus groups with young people on how to navigate career pathways, and this concept of connections came up over and over again, both the power of, but again, the sort of struggle of like how to navigate and how to forge new connections. So there's a bunch of strategies here that I think are worth calling out, but maybe I'll just name a couple. The first is to to harken back to that strength of weak ties point, another one of the research statistics that we cite in this section is the fact that even brief industry chats can yield long-term wage premiums, which is sort of a shocking finding out of new research from the UK, particularly in the sort of idea of like career talks. Now, one of the interesting things that a researcher named Anthony Mann at the OECD has been trying to push on in the kind of career exposure world is that we can sometimes treat career exposure as an exercise, like in literal exposure. So if we think back, Nick, to like when, well, I don't want to date you, but when I was in grade school, career exposure was a poster on the wall with like a picture of a nurse, a picture of a fireman, right? Like literal cartoons of what the world of work was. Not only is that not representative in a variety of ways of career options for young people, but it's not a two-way conversation. And one of the important things coming out in the research on this concept of industry chats is that it's not just that you're learning about a job that's out there by talking to someone, it's that it's a two-way conversation in which you as a student are also reflecting on your own identity and critically thinking about your career. So I just want to put out there, like, if you're already doing career exposure work, which I suspect you are, you're part of the NAF network, thinking about two-way conversations is a really powerful, in some ways simple strategy, but that ensures that you're sort of getting the long-term dividends around a student's expanded network. The second, I'm going to just beat a dead horse here, which is like, before you try and expand a student's network, find out who they already know, but who they might not be mobilizing, right? Because that's a version of expanding their network. It's actually tapping their existing network in a new way, right? So that harkens back to step one. Another thing that we emphasize here is the importance of both a critical mentoring agenda lens, which is sort of a cousin to critical race theory, meaning actually helping mentors or supervisors, particularly if they hail from the dominant culture, reflect on their own identities and celebrate students' existing identities if they're from a different background. If that is not done, right, we can expand networks all day, but we may actually be scaling bias, not connection, right? We could be scaling the wrong thing by expanding students' networks. And an additional sort of addendum to that, even more broadly beyond just race as a sort of domain to pay attention to, is the phenomenon that sociologists call homophily. So if we're trying to scale trust rather than scaling distrust and bias when we expand students' networks, a really clear way to do that is to actually help students and whoever they're meeting, whether it's another student or an employer or a community member, identify hidden similarities, identify something that they have in common. And that can actually really plant the seed of a long-term trusting relationship. All too often, though, when we bring a student to meet an industry expert or go on a field trip to a work site, we're emphasizing inadvertently asymmetry, right? We're saying this person is so different from you. They work in this totally different field. They are much further along in their career. And inadvertently, I think that we can sort of kill trust on the front end of those interactions. So there's just a couple of strategies that I think, obviously I'm excited about scale and expansion, but only in service of scaling trusting connections with sort of a spirit of reciprocity embedded in them. And I think that's where the real work is in this step.
Awesome. This is actually a point I'd like to just mention to those in the audience. We're actually going to start having some data on this very soon related to our academies. So in this year, the 2021 student survey, in which we had over 19,000 student responses, we actually had a social capital section. So in that section, we asked students questions like, through my NAF experience, I have gotten the contact information of 2 adults I could turn to in my career path for advice. Or if I have a problem, I know I can turn to an adult through my NAF experience to help me. So we're just starting out, Julia, and starting to get some of these things for our academies. But if your academy had over 10 students participate in the student survey in April, you'll actually get some of that data back to see how your students are responding to questions like this. But in the interest of our 15 minutes left, our session will end here at 45. I'm going to pivot us to step 4 because I want to get through all 5 questions, or sorry, all 5 sections, and still have time for questions and comments. Go away, little thing, so I can get this up. Okay, so step 4, leveraging, and you've alluded to this, that ed tech that connects. Now, this is something NAF and many in our network are really interested in, and we have terrific educators, really wanting to connect students to industry partners or just leverage some of that ed tech, but it can be challenging, right, for a number of reasons. Can you tell us, just in your experience, what's been kind of the most successful when it comes to leveraging the ed tech behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry to be eating. I'm pregnant and can't go like half an hour without eating. So I just couldn't
we don't take it personal. It's okay.
I just wanted to explain that I was just like casually snacking. I mean, I was, but yeah. So as I sort of alluded to, this is where my research really started, which was like seeing this untapped potential of using technology to particularly expand students' networks, particularly in service of step 3. So maybe I just want to echo that finding, which is as we've looked over the past 6 years or so at the ed tech market, the real opportunity, or I'd say sort of like the real disruption opportunity in this space is to radically expand students' weak tie networks using technology, not to try and use technology as a surrogate for strong ties, right? Which is what we saw over the past year as sort of an epic challenge and in some cases failure, right? For students who felt, I think, immensely isolated in Zoom and other platforms. And so part of that is thinking about, based on students' career interests and evolving ambitions, who is out of reach? What is a relationship that is currently out of reach because of time, cost, geography, that could be put within reach using technology? And starting there, not starting with connections that are actually totally within reach, but using this like crappy alternative, which I think is sort of where we see underwhelming experiences using online platforms. The other thing that I sort of want to call out here, well, a couple things. One is that research has consistently shown that we build empathy more effectively over multimodal platforms. At the same time, what we see a lot of innovators in this space finding is that to really drive engagement, you have to be multi-platform, not just multimodal. So multimodal refers to video, text, email, right? So we build more empathy over the phone than we do over text, but we build more empathy over video than we do over the phone. The more ways in which we can actually use our 5 senses to engage, the better. However, again, that I think can lead to sort of like video or die mentality around technology platforms. Whereas we know that Gen Z and younger generations are using text, particularly to solicit sort of informal and on-demand advice, and that can be a really powerful driver of progress and persistence. And so thinking about multiple modalities, both in terms of the format and in terms of the platform, I think is important here. The last thing I'll say is that, part of what the research says is that our relationships decay if we don't maintain them, right? So Nick, if I never reach out to you for the next year, and then I suddenly reach out, like I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I forged enough trust and reciprocity with you that you'd respond, but like the likelihood goes way down. At the same time, one of the ways in which traditional social media has actually totally changed a lot of our lives is that it's radically disrupted the decay rates of a lot of our friendships, right? Like I still can update my like first grade classmates on what I had for lunch yesterday because I have a Facebook account or an Instagram, right? So our ability to remain in touch is much stronger if we use technology platforms with that in mind. So when I think about a model like NAF, your students are meeting all sorts of people. My question back to you is, are those connections lasting? And we'll get to that in the last step, but that's the last place where I think ed tech has a real role to play. It's almost like a digital Rolodex that could give your students deeper and broader reservoirs to dip back into as their lives and circumstances shift, and frankly allow them to catalyze some sort of an alumni community. Again, I don't know where you guys are organizationally on this, but catalyze an alumni community in a much more reliable way than if we leave that to chance and sort of an individual student's ability to get back in touch, which again, developmentally may not be their mindset at the time of engaging in their first or second work-based learning experience, but down the line can actually be a truly powerful resource for career options and optionality.
Yeah, that's something we're undergoing a new strategic plan right now, and part of that includes just connecting our alumni way more than they currently are, because many, I'm sure, are tackling the same issues, looking to overcome similar barriers, and they can be resources to each other. So that's definitely something we're trying to pick up, and we may connect over in the not too distant future. Really quickly though, I want to hit step 5 and then open it up for some questions and some comments from the audience. So last but certainly not least, and something you've already alluded to, is to build networks that last and to make sure students remain connected and continue to expand their networks. So how or why should educators keep this in mind? You know, what can we do today that perhaps is going to facilitate this step?
Yeah, I'll throw out a statistic from Postsecondary that, you know, I know is a little bit distant from the high school space, but it's so telling here. You know, when I present my research in post-secondary spaces, it's often like, oh yeah, an alumni network. That's what we're talking about. But if you look at the data, only 9%, it's according to a Strata Gallup poll, only 9% of alumni from colleges report that their alumni network was useful or very useful in the job market. That is a ton of untapped social capital that we're actually charging college students for, right? Like that's part of the bill of goods they're being sold, and yet it's not being accessed and mobilized at the rates that I think anyone would hope. And I would venture that it's sort of similar if you look at sort of high school students' experiences as well. So what that tells us is that there's a real opportunity to do more to sort of maintain the stickiness of networks and provide more seamless, sort of frictionless infrastructure for students to remain connected. A couple places where we've seen this really shine, it comes more in the post-secondary space. The only real alumni, there's 2 alumni plays that have come across my radar in the last year. One is that Big Picture Learning acquired a tool called Alumni Toolkit, which is a tech infrastructure to help them actually mobilize their alums as well, particularly to think about alums as sources of mentorship and internship opportunities. But the second is, I'm going to botch the name. I think it's called it's not Edmentum. I'll look at it. It's like Edmium. I can't keep track of these new education nouns that people make up, but it's a Denver-based organization that is a sort of offshoot of Denver Public School alum thinking about ways to connect back to the district. But this is real like white space for innovation in K-12 is my point. Definitely. So just a couple strategies to name though. And this connects back to the power of near peers as both sources of social support and social leverage that are highly trusted by young people. There's a program called Co-op operating in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. They're an education to employment player helping low-income minority college grads break into tech. And their entire scale strategy is an alumni engagement strategy because their alumni serve as near peer, they call them captains, mentors to their current participants. They also become the referral network through which students are then acquiring jobs. And it's such a powerful reminder that your alumni network is a resource hiding in plain sight to both provide support, but to provide new opportunities to students, and actually maybe better positioned to that than some of the formal partnerships that you spend a lot of your time forging. So that's one way to think about students remaining connected, not just as a alumni engagement play or get everyone onto LinkedIn play. Those are really important, but also as a scale play, right? Because networks sort of beget networks over time. So I could obviously go deeper in all these steps, but I'll leave it there so we have a little time for questions.
No, that was great. And yes, this is definitely a conversation we could be having over like a few hours, but I do want to leave some time here for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but you can find the link to this website I've been sharing the whole time in the chat, as well as the playbook itself attached to this session. But I invite anyone now to come off of mute and ask any questions to our expert Julia here. Feel free to type them in the chat or anything bubbling up throughout the talk here. We have about 9 minutes left in the session, so I wanted to give some time for Q&A and then also have some announcements here at the end, just in closing. So anyone have anything they want to ask our expert today?
Hey.
Or share what you're doing in your context.
Yeah, or share what you're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Righty. So I've got a quick question for you, Julia. I am really fascinated with the idea of getting those within the student sphere to work with students. Do you consider anything when it comes on to quality of these web networks? Is that important to you? Should we on the other side of it be thinking, okay, are we looking at excellence here, or will we just go about with anything? Is there any reference to that in your playbook?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And we didn't spend a ton of time. The way Nick and I got to know each other is actually around measurement. And we didn't talk about measurement over the last half hour or so, but incredibly important, right, to pay attention to quality. Because like I said, scaling relationships could scale, like a negative relationship is actually worse than no relationship at all in a young person's life, because a negative interaction can sort of be destructive to a student's sense of self-worth and self-efficacy. That's been well documented in mentoring research. So this is like high risk, high reward work that we're talking about. And one of the resources I'll put into the chat is we published a report called The Missing Metrics, which highlights emerging measurement strategies in this space across 4 domains, which is the quantity of connections students have, the quality of those relationships, the structure of their networks, and students' ability to mobilize relationships. And within that quality domain, we give a number of example survey items that we've seen used in the space to really measure the quality of relationships, not just but like in a way that reflects the student's experience. Does that make sense? Not just saying, okay, the student attended his internship, so we're going to assume that his relationship with his supervisor or with his mentor was a good one. And I think getting that granular and data driven is really critical, and doing it in a formative way where then the student and whoever the relationship is can sort of look at that data together and improve upon their relationship, hopefully, is also really important. So I don't know, Nick, if there's stuff you want to name on the NAF front. You sort of what you're doing, but I think that step has to go alongside any new designs that you're embarking on. Oh, thanks for putting that in, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to respond to folks here as they're looking for the playbook. No, I don't have too much to add on that, just that we're also looking at certain competencies and trying to develop a more competency-based approach. And this will definitely all be tied into that, because like you said, Julia, you really want to be intentional about building networks. It shouldn't just be an assumed byproduct of a work-based learning experience like an internship or, you know, a job shadow or something like that. Yeah, anyone else from the audience? We've got about 6 minutes left if there's been a burning question on your mind.
I have a quick one, Julia. I wanted to circle back quickly when you were kind of comparing and contrasting multimodal. And I think you had a comparison, but it may have gotten lost or I may have missed it. Do you mind circling back to that concept quickly, please?
Yeah, so I was outlining there's 2 ways in which we should think about multimodal. One is that if you're operating a virtual model, what research around particularly empathy formation has shown us is that you're more likely to form an empathetic connection with someone if you're using multiple modalities. And the lowest level is text or email. The next highest is phone, where you can actually hear tone, right? And the sort of highest is video, because you can actually see and take social cues. This is where, if we think about technology getting better and better over time, particularly after this year, like people are trying to make video technology even better, even more sort of like real life. So that's one way in which understanding that, like, if the goal, back to this notion of quality relationships, if the goal is to create sort of deeper connections, greater empathy, even across a screen, you would want to use video technology, right? Or at least be aware of the fact that text and phone are less advantageous on that front. However, the kind of other side of that coin that we're hearing less from the empirical research side and more from practitioners that are doing work in this space is that young people today want to have a variety of ways to communicate with the people in their lives. They don't want to be locked into just video. They want to be able to use text message. They want to be able to use email, etc. And so what a lot of tools, this is maybe like I know Josh on your team at NAF is thinking a lot about building tools, but a lot of tools are using what are called a relay device, which means that you can, within a given app, actually be using your own text messaging in the way that, like, if you use DoorDash or Instacart, you get a text from your Instacart person, but they're doing that actually through their app. It's just coming into the text on your phone. So that gives you the flexibility as an educator or a staff member to be centralizing your communications, but reaching students through a variety of modes. So that's just, I think it's always interesting when the empirical research tells us one thing and then our young people tell us something slightly different, because the world has changed since that empirical research was conducted. And I think it's important to hold both at once.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
We have maybe time for one more. Is there any other burning questions Julia can address, or anything you'd like to share? Maybe some light bulb went off as we were talking here, hopefully. Anyone? We don't bite. Well, that's okay. If there is another question, feel free to drop it in the chat or anything like that. But I'll just kind of end with some outstanding words for Julia here. Thank you very much, Julia, for joining us here today for this very special research and tech talk here at NAF Next. I always ask our guests in these series, how can our network or anyone in the audience keep up to date with the work you're doing? You know, are you on social media posting results, or what's the best way to keep up to date on the work you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So whoyouknow.org, which is a really cheesy name, but it is what it is. Whoyouknow.org has all of our latest resources and research, and actually the version of the playbook that Nick was sharing throughout this session is going to be constantly updated with new tools and resources. Right. So for example, just like there's a new Search Institute survey around social capital coming out this month that will be uploaded there just as a way to get information. We also have a blog at christenseninstitute.org/blog where my colleague Minar and I are regularly posting about sort of emerging innovations in the space, interviewing innovators and tech folks, et cetera, that are just doing interesting things. And then lastly, I put my email address in the chat, but I'll also put my Twitter handle. I have like a love-hate relationship with Twitter, like I think any rational human does in 2021, but I occasionally tweet. So feel free to follow me.
No, thank you very much, Julia. And that's hilarious that you actually mentioned the Search Institute and some of those measures they're coming out with, because our next Research and Tech Talk will actually be with Dr. Ashley Boat from the Search Institute talking about some of those things. Yeah, exactly. So the date for that talk hasn't been scheduled yet for anyone in the audience, but when it is, we're looking towards the end of July for that talk. But you can check when it is finalized. It will be announced on our ASH homepage on ASH, and then both our NAF Educator Facebook page as well as the NAF Research and Tech LinkedIn page, which I dropped links to earlier in the chat, but I'll do it again here before we close. Julia, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with before we hop off here?
I'll just end on the fact that I think opportunity is a social phenomenon. So hopefully we can all get more deliberate and rigorous about investing in and measuring students' networks to really level and frankly change the playing field.
Mm-hmm. And now hopefully our audience will consider you a weak tie and can reach out to you.
Yes, I am. I gave my information, so it's official.
Great. Well, thank you again, Julia, and thank you everyone to taking the time out of your agenda here today to join us. Have a good rest of the conference.
Thank you for joining us today.
Before you leave, a few quick things.
The session evaluation and code are available to you right now.
Please take a minute to give us your important feedback as it assists us in future conferences.